Welcome to the Racial Equity, Housing, Homeownership, and Unfulfilled Promise panel discussion. We're glad to have you join us today. This is going to be a dynamic conversation full of panelists and a moderator that is sure to blow your mind. I want to start by introducing someone. She is a veteran in the mortgage industry, a thought leader, an advocate, and a change agent. She serves as the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the Maryland Bankers Association, and she worked at Fannie Mae for over 20 years. She has an extensive background in business development, corporate social responsibility, diversity, inclusion, community relations, and the list goes on. Our boss lady, our panelist, Charmaine Brown. Next, he is the Vice President of Policy Advocacy for the National Association of Realtors. He manages NAR's new 45-member Fair Housing Policy Committee. Prior to his current role, he served 10 years as the highest-ranking career official in HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. There, he pursued large-scale, high-profile cases that address systematic discrimination, providing widespread relief, including $70 million to state, federal, local government, to state and local government agencies, nonprofit organizations to fight discrimination in local communities. He also served as the Associate Deputy Assistant for the Economic Affairs at HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research. Please welcome our power broker, Bryan Greene. He is a vice president and Mid-Atlantic market leader for the Enterprise Community Partners, facilitating affordable housing and community development, transactions and policy implementation, collaborating with public-private sector stakeholders in the DMV. Prior, he worked at the AFL-CIO Housing Investment Trust. He also serves as Senator Barbara Mikulski's legislative assistant. He was a mayoral appointed to serve as chair of DC's Housing Production Trust Fund Advisory Board in DC. He is an ordained minister, founding member of 100 Black Men, and founder of his own all-volunteer, no murder DC movement. Please welcome a visionary leader, David Bowers. And last but not least, he has had over 30 years of experience in housing finance, the economic development, real estate development, policy advisory, serving consulting. He's a senior consultant to nonprofits, the faith-based community, public, private sector organization, the list goes on. He's the founder and board president of the Network for Developing Conscious Communities, who are creating new and cutting-edge advocacy around economic development. Please welcome to the stage our moderator, trailblazer, Ron Hantz, and all of our panels. Thank you. Ron, I pass the mic to you.
Well, Kelly, thank you for the introduction of myself as well as my panelists this morning. We're going to be engaging in what I would hope is a very intriguing and very well-needed conversation around racial equity and home ownership. And so before I enter my colleagues into the conversation, I want to lay some groundwork in terms of how we got to the space we are in terms of the divide around racial home ownership, and particularly this widening effort around equity and wealth in the Black community and mainstream society. A lot of this work that we're seeing in housing predates all of us. It goes back to the early days of the 1900s, where policies were being established locally, through local governments, through state governments, through the federal government, and other private sector partners that were intentional about creating racial divide in America and American neighborhoods. And unfortunately, that divide was targeted at Black and other communities of color. And so we've not really got beyond those early policies, whether they were racial zoning policies, whether they were policies that affected access to capital, whether they were planning and zoning policies. We still live in the wake of many of those early policies that were established. Those policies relegated people of color to certain areas of the city in terms of home ownership opportunities. And most of the time, those areas were the most undesirable areas. And so we're going to do a deep dive as much as we can in the time that's allowed it to talk about that. So where does that bring us in present day? Well, we know the home ownership rate is reflective of that. White home ownership is about 74% nationwide. Black home ownership rate hovers around 42%, maybe 43%. Latinos around 50%, and then the Asian community around 57%. When we look at the issues of the divide in terms of home ownership, we've seen a steep decline from 94 to 2019 in home ownership, particularly racially. And so I know some of my panelists today are going to talk about what happened during the 2000, mid 2008, when we had a big decline of Black home ownership here in the country. So I'm going to open up this discussion with Ms. Brown. And so, Charmaine, I want to ask the question of you in terms of looking back over the historical framework of what has happened. What realizable solutions can we start to articulate and as architects to shift this paradigm around the inequities around home ownership and create more frameworks that bring into question equitable frameworks for racial community development?
Ron, that's a really great question. And first, let me thank you and the other panelists, as well as Diana, for the opportunity to join this really important discussion today. The promise unfulfilled and the dream deferred, as Langston Hughes would say, deferred for far too many for far too long. I want to add to your remarks around sort of the historical aspects of what we're facing today, and then go to your question in terms of some potential solutions, because I do think that there is a core and pervasive issue that if we were to address, not that we would be able to turn the ship on a dime, but we certainly would be having a very different conversation, I think, in the next 10 years. But just to add a couple of points to how you have framed this discussion. Another impact to the racial wealth divide that is driving very disparate outcomes for BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous people of color, is the environmental justice issue. When we talk about devaluation and depreciation of property, we know that Black people were property and capital before they could earn capital. And sure, we're seeing that show up today. But the environmental piece is also an important part of this discussion. And let me just say quickly that a GAO report indicated that Black people were 89% more likely to live near incinerators and in environmentally hazardous areas. So when you look at determinants, health determinants and outcomes, and you look at some of the disparities that you're talking about, we cannot forget that environmental justice, as we continue to face more climate issues and extreme weather issues, we've got to keep EJ at the center of this discussion. Now, I'll back up and answer your question. I just wanted to add that, because when you, and I know some of the other panelists will talk about the foreclosure crisis and the wealth that was lost during that crisis and all of that, but To answer your question, as a diversity, equity, and inclusion professional, look at the real estate industry. Look at who's making the decisions for BIPOC and underrepresented people. That has largely gone unchanged. We talk about increasing diversity. The real estate finance industry today remains 20% ethnically diverse, 60% male. We need to get more people with the lived experiences at the table in decision-making roles and focus on how to increase diversity in this industry. I heard some themes today around ingenuity and innovation. All of those things come from more diversity, and we need to be more diverse and more inclusive in our industry in order to start to get to some of the solutions that are there. And we can talk about some of them later, because the MBA, the Mortgage Bankers Association, we are doing a lot in this area. But diversity matters, representation matters, and we are still seeing an industry that is largely white and male. And so I believe that's key to whatever decisions that we make going forward. I will stop there, but I do believe that we need to be more diverse in order to get to equity and some of these other outcomes that we desire.
Okay, well, thank you, Charmaine. Well, Bryan, you're in the private sector and you're seeing things differently than those of us who work in nonprofit work, and that's the work that I embellish myself in. What are you seeing in terms of shifting of this paradigm around racial equity, and particularly how it's relating to home ownership in your industry? Bryan, you're muted.
Oh, I said some great things. I gave you the magic answer, but all right, I'll give you the longer answer now. I am in the private sector. I've actually also worked in government for 29 years. And let me just say, you know, I see the issues we're facing right now as multi-layered. No doubt, discrimination today and historic discrimination have played a role in where we are. When I talk about the discrimination today, you know, the federal government, state and local governments have enforcement agencies that are responsible for addressing that. They aren't very well resourced. I worry that if they're not on their game, we're going to fall backwards. We need to make sure that we have a market, you know, that's policed, and that these 50+ year anti-discrimination laws are strongly enforced. And that's something at National Association of Realtors, you know, we're advocating, because we are professionals, and just like the American Medical Association wouldn't want quacks out there claiming to be doctors, in 2021, the realtors are impressing upon folks that this association wants to serve everyone and wants those who engage in discrimination to face consequences. So we actually have a very rigorous program to try to address that in our advocacy. That said, my concern is that even if we addressed all the discrimination that persists, we're not going to close the minority homeownership gap because of the legacy of discrimination and what it wrought. So, you know, if you go back to the 20s, you know, we acknowledge that the realtors were at the forefront of advocating for racially restrictive covenants, but then also government encouraged them, required them, and certainly required segregation if you wanted to get a government insured loan. That was standard practice, official practice for decades. And then, you know, even after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, these practices continued. And while they've abated, we're talking about now people of color and African Americans in particular who have not had that opportunity to amass wealth and to have the equity in homes that's necessary to, you know, continue buying homes in this current generation. And that is reflected in the data that you see today. So if we just look at 2020, 5% of home buyers were African American. But when you dig deeper, you find that that population actually has higher educational attainment than the white population who buy homes. So it means that, you know, master's degrees and doctorates, you know, these are the folks who are able to earn enough to buy compared to, say, high school graduates who are whites. And a large part of it is because of wealth. You find that a lot of the white buyers, their down payments are coming from sales of previous homes. African-American buyers and other minorities, a higher percentage of them are first-time home buyers. We also find that they're also carrying great debt. African-Americans are carrying, 42% of these buyers are carrying student loan debt compared to 21% of white buyers. And they have more of it. So in a way, when you look at it and you look at African Americans who actually are purchasing and owning homes now, they're really super people. And I would actually say super women, because more of the of those successful homeowners are single-headed households or single income households, you know, so skewed towards women. And so in this current market, my great concern is with prices rising, these folks who have to be quite persistent to get through are going to have a more challenging time, especially, you know, as single-headed households. So the issue we really are dealing with are the cascading effects of the past, principally. You know, folks are credit worthy, but they're also more credit burdened. And we also have a housing finance system that does not recognize the credit worthiness, doesn't give credit to those who are credit worthy, because we don't look at 20 years of rental income that many people have paid reliably and on time, utility bills and the like. So we need to expand the pie and find those ways to expand the pie to bring in those people who are credit worthy. But we also need to find ways to increase the inventory of housing, because even the average American cannot put out cash to buy homes at the prices that we're seeing today.
All right, thank you. I want to just piggyback on what you said about expanding this pie. David, your organization works on policy. A lot of policy around communities, expanding this economic pie in terms of the work that you're doing. In 1919, around 1913, Woodrow Wilson implemented policies at the highest level of government that were racially divisive around the country. And so these last 4 years, in terms of, from a policy perspective, give us your analysis of what has happened or not happened in the last 4 years that has really impacted this racial equity question, and particularly home ownership in the divide of whites and black, and speaking to what Bryan was talking about in terms of just governmental policies that might have had the negative effect these last 4 years.
Sure, Ron, thanks. And let me also echo the thanks for Diana and the Affordable Housing Conference for having us here today. As Charmaine mentioned, it's an honor to be here with all of you all. I want to pick up on kind of two things. One that's most recent, and then going back over the last few years, what's exciting. I think we're seeing some focus now just in the last few months with the Homeowners Assistance Fund that was enacted as part of the American Rescue Plan. That includes, for the first time, a Homeowners Assistance Fund that helps address homeowners facing instability due to the pandemic. So the fact that, you know, there are dollars that are available as part of the emergency response, right? The rescue plan for home ownership, the fact that as part of what's called, you know, the infrastructure bill includes a Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, right? That's been proposed. So the fact that new legislation is out there either being enacted or being proposed that would specifically deal with home ownership, I think is exciting. But Ron, I think what for me is actually listen, there have clearly been things that have happened intentionally or coincidentally, some might say, that have had a disproportionate impact on people of color in general and African Americans, and you know, those have been well kind of laid out, right, that have helped to strip away wealth and health, which has a physical and financial cost on people. So the extent to which we don't respond effectively to something like a pandemic, you know, people of color in general and Black people in particular tend to be more disproportionately impacted, and that has a ripple effect. So I think we have to connect dots. What's been exciting to me has been the movement and the conversation around reparations in the country over the last few years. And I think that specifically the fact that we can point to the fact that in the state of Maryland, right, a bill that was introduced, right, by Delegate Fisher to create a task force to look at reparation. Dr. Lawrence Brown has come out with his book, The Black Butterfly, which looks at issues nationally, but particularly focused in Baltimore, a real drill down that looks at issues of the history of the stripping of wealth, the displacement of people of color, Black people in particular, and has specific recommendations around how to provide kind of restorative and reparative types of justice that includes real dollars and in real investments from both the public and private sector that would help build wealth within communities. The fact that we're looking at enterprise that supported research that's being done in the District of Columbia around potentially making a case around reparation. Rothstein's book, Color of Law, looking at a place like Levittown and really delineating what was done, what was the harm done by whom, to whom, quantifying the cost and the impacts of that. California's governor just signing legislation to seat members of or starting to now seat members of a task force. So all of that to say that if we really want to talk about bridging the equity gaps, if we're going to have we collectively, all of us in this industry and in the country, are going to have a real conversation about bridging the gaps, then we have to talk about repairing the harm. And if we're going to really have real conversations about that, then that conversation, you can call it reparation, you can call it reparative justice, restorative justice, you can call it cotton candy and roses. But the key is we have to have serious conversations about what harm was done, quantifying that and talking about real ways to repair that harm in order to bridge that gap, right? Otherwise, what we're going to be looking at are things that will do some good for sure, but may not go all the way. So I think that's been one of the most exciting things for me, seeing that there's more conversation about that, not only at the federal level, Judiciary Committee passed out HR 40 Reparation Task Force, but at the state and local level. The last thing I'll say, Ron, just in response to this, is that I also think we have to look at issues around appropriations, the issues around land use, issues around different types of ownership, quote unquote, traditional ownership, but alternative types, cooperatives, land trusts, and the like. We have to look at income policy. And what does that mean? Issues that relate to the income and the building of wealth, whether it's for people at the lower income scale or whether it's for folks who may be at the higher income scale, what I call the employer and the owner. And Charmaine alluded to that earlier. So the fact that we have more folks looking at how do we put wealth in the hands of owners, if you would, and employers, as well as kind of the labor force, I think are also important.
Thank you, thank you. Charmaine brought up a point of the conversation about environmental justice and its relationship to Black communities and wealth building. We know the life expectancy of Blacks is about 10 years shorter than that of the white population. In Baltimore City, which David, you're familiar with, and others may, there's a community entitled called Jewel Heights. And there's an upper community in Baltimore called Roland Park. And they're probably less than 10 miles away, but the life expectancy is almost 20 years different. in terms of those particular communities. So if we look at talking about racial equity and looking at what has happened in the last year regarding corporate response to racial inequality, with major corporations giving funds out and allocating funds to address the issues internally as well as geographically across the country, should we start looking at, and should private sector as well as government start looking at wealth building initiatives within their programmatic work that they're doing? And that there should be a wealth building indicator or wealth building tool that groups are now looking at as it relates to particularly communities of color. I just want to lay that out there as a conversational piece. Should they have a commitment to build wealth in the work that they're doing, particularly as it relates to Black and other indigenous communities of color? Charmaine?
The short answer is yes. But let's dig in a little bit. I want to agree with David's point around some sort of intervention, no matter what you call it. But I also want to enter into the conversation more explicitly, the fact that no amount of cash is going to solve for a system that was not designed for BIPOC people, that is still suffering from practices that continue today. So in other words, we can put a fix on this end, but if we don't stop the bleeding, then we're not going to see the results we need to see. The research that I want to allude to also touches on Bryan's point, where he talked about Blacks who are more educated not achieving homeownership at the rates of whites. The reality is a white high school dropout is more likely to be a homeowner than a Black college graduate. The reality is Jamal and John can have the same resume, Jamal and John, same resume, but John's going to get called back more frequently, 50% more likely to get called back, and John is more likely to get the job. So we have to look at fixing, while we have this conversation, a system that is broken. So we can talk about repair, but we've got to go deeper to eliminate the problem. Now, to answer your question about corporate America, we've also seen a lot of actions coming out of like the CEO in Action Pledge and PwC. But I read something this week that I want to share with you because it goes to your question. And it says that it's a Harvard Business Review article that a recent survey revealed 93% of corporate leaders say DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is at the top of their agenda, but only 34% believe in its strength. So what's going on there? It's important to us, but I don't really believe that it is all that valuable. I say that to say, putting funding into communities of color and communities who have suffered historically the harm and continue to suffer the harm today is important, but we also have to go a lot deeper than that. We can't simply throw money at this problem, but I also want to give the other panelists a chance to weigh in. But I would say yes and.
Okay.
So,
Go ahead, Bryan.
all right. It feels like the Jeopardy buzzer. So, which is good. So, 2 points. One, Richard Rothstein, who wrote The Color of Law, is a good friend. And back when I was at HUD, and HUD was working on a regulation called the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, which was requiring that communities look at their racial history and their past development through the lens of that history, and take action. We had him in a couple of times, and this was even before he wrote The Color of Law, and he really stressed that the big problem is Americans don't know their history, and it's hard to get political will for efforts if people don't understand even the foundation for it. Then there are many people who do understand the history and don't want it to be taught, right? This is a big debate that's occurring right now. And, you know, I was talking to an historian who said, without understanding this country's racial history, the present day doesn't make any sense. You know, well, why do we have these hyper-segregated neighborhoods? It doesn't make sense unless you really know what's happened. And so I think it's very important for companies and others to focus on wealth building, but I think they're going to endure only if people really understand why it's necessary. And then we're going to, you know, the only way to really to get more of it and more meaningful programs is if people understand the history. One thing I'll stress is one of the most important and one of the most impactful vehicles for wealth building is housing. And what we're seeing now, and I think all of you have seen these stories about African-American homes not appraising at the levels people expect they should. And, you know, many of the high-profile stories involve people who have, say, a white person sit in their house for the purposes of the appraisal, and in one recent story, see the appraised value double. You know, and that may happen if your house is in a white neighborhood. A bigger systemic issue is this question of whether entire communities are being devalued. And so as we work to close the home ownership gap, my concern is that still people of color are inheriting a leaky bucket, that they're not gaining the equity that they should. And so that we're going to continue to have this expanding gap if African Americans and other people of color aren't truly gaining the American dream when they gain home ownership. So we have to roll up and look at this, because that issue and addressing that issue is going to have a much greater impact on this country probably than individual corporation wealth building programs.
Mhm.
And Ron, if I could jump in there.
Go ahead, David.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. You know, it's interesting to me, this notion of where we got to have a vision of where we're trying to get to, and then obviously a plan on getting there, accountability, right, and some participation. I think to Bryan's point, I think about the job I was in before I got to Enterprise was dealing with home ownership, and I remember that post the kind of economic collapse back in the mid 2000s. That it wasn't long after that happened that the lie, the story, the narrative was told. Well, this wouldn't have happened if we weren't trying to help those people become homeowners, right? And so people started, no one said, well, this really happened because of greed, deception, bad policies, bad enforcement. It was no. You were trying to force us to help those people, right? And because of that, we have this global collapse. And so we got to be clear, I think, one, that there's this notion of, are we really trying to close wealth gaps? Yes or no? In the public sector and in the private sector, Ron, to your question, right? Is that really where we're trying to get to? And if the answer to that question is yes, then we have to say, okay, then what are the policies as a corporate citizen? What are the policies as a federal, state, local government that have to be in place to deal with the history, as Bryan said, right, that we're trying to overcome, to make new systems that will be effective and just, to Charmaine's point. And third point, and I saw someone put this in the chat about the housing indicator tool, the notion of how will we keep ourselves accountable as a corporation? What are our KPIs, right? As a local government, what are our benchmarks? How are we transparent about what our indicators are and how we are holding ourselves accountable? And then the last thing, I think, or the next thing I would say, which is interesting, again, going back to Dr. Brown's book and others, this notion of having impacted communities a part of the participatory process of decision making, of having power, of making decisions of where money goes. And so whether that is a Black-owned development company saying and being in conversations with financiers about, here's the kind of capital we really need, right? Or it could be low-income folks, right, who live in Druid Hill, who to your point, Ron, Druid Heights, who may say, hey, look, here's how we think the money ought to be spent in our neighborhood. That's a wildly different approach than, you know, the wise father telling us what we need, right? Which is so much of what we are used to. And so I think that we need to have some real open and honest conversations, but then create those systems to keep up. It's been very interesting for us in our work at Enterprise around even our Equitable Path Forward initiative to bring new types of capital and engage with Black-owned and BIPOC-led development companies, for-profits and nonprofits, in a different way, right? To try to deal with issues of real risk versus perceived risk. And how can we provide capital in different types of ways for developers? Well, the same thing also goes for homeowners, right? If we're trying to help people become homeowners, what is real risk versus perceived risk, right? And how do we create those new systems that will help us really bridge these gaps?
Hey, Ron, do you think I could get 1 minute to underline something that David just said?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I think these were great points. And when you said, do people really want to make a difference? I think that's very important, because the issue of knowledge is one thing, but I'm finding that, well, it's two things, that there are a lot of people who have this perception that the group we're talking about are not worthy, right? That they haven't, they don't deserve it. They haven't earned it. I think we have a lot of data to show otherwise. But even when we have the data, I'm finding there's just this resistance, right? In our association, we did a recent survey just asking people whether they believe discrimination still exists in the housing market. And about half of our membership says they don't think it still exists. And we've had many high-profile examples of how discrimination still occurs. So if people are faced with this information and still deny it, that is a problem. I think that is a problem of will. So we have to figure that out.
All right. I want to just talk about, mention a few things. One, in terms of, in the 70s, when we had a proliferation of Black mayors throughout America, they met and collectively developed a collective economic development plan going forward for Black America. And so it was mayors such as Jackson, Maynard Jackson in Atlanta, who held up the building of the Hartsfield Airport because there wasn't enough minority and Black participation as contractors. And throughout the country, we saw mayors in Washington, D.C. and other cities take on that challenge to say that we have to have inclusionary economic participation from Black businesses in the rebuilding of particularly local infrastructure. So that's one point I want to make. Going round table now, we've seen some new discussions, and David sort of alluded to this, around CRA now, where it's moving away from the definition of low to moderate income defined as to having some racial indicators in place in the legislation going forward, so that we can start looking at racially what is happening around banks and their funding around the landscape. And then thirdly, there is a movement now for Black voices and brown voices in the CRA movement, where others have really led the voicing of what the concerns are in Black and brown communities. And so there is some movement organizing from local grassroots groups to really address more of a platform of how we're defining what our needs are. And so I did want to just to bring those into question in terms of going back and looking at all the intersectors that are impacting the real question around how do we do this. And I think it goes to what Bryan is saying and David is saying, we're all saying, having some will. Does America have the will to want to change this discord? I'm looking at someone's in the chat, they're talking about racial disparities has cost this country $2.9 trillion since 2019. So the question becomes, is there the will on the table to really change these paradigms? Reverend Barber calls this Jim Crow 2. We're in another Jim Crow area. And so if you want to speak to that, feel free to.
So I'm not an economist, but you know, I have heard some economists push back on this GDP loss issue, more or less saying, well, the problem is we're talking about GDP that could be gained with respect to people of color, and there are a lot of people, you know, who would rather sacrifice that GDP. You know, I think unless people appreciate the downwind effects of everyone benefiting in a society, it's going to be hard. I think other people mentioned Heather McGhee's book, you know, The Sum of Us, and you know what she describes as drained pool politics. I mean, again, I think there are people who are making a trade-off, and they're saying this, you know, social segregation or social inequity for them is a greater value than having something better that they could have if you know, we could more collectively share in our prosperity. So I think that still ends up going back to will, but you know, I think to the extent that we can demonstrate or help people see how all benefit, that might be the biggest driver. You know, as long as I think people believe they're doing something for other people and that there's no dividend paid to them, I think it may continue to be hard.
You know, I want to go back to what David's point about the narrative around the foreclosure crisis, because I think a lot of it goes back to who's controlling, not just the message, but who's controlling the policies. We can't control people's will. You know, it'd be great if we all lived in the same America, but there are two very different countries depending on where you're born. And that has to change in a way that is not contingent upon somebody's will. So I don't have the answer, and there's no silver bullet, but it's there. The change has to come from a place where treating people of color, BIPOC people, as human, as worthy, is not someone's will. I don't know what the answer is for that, but it just can't. It can't be based on whether Bryan wakes up today and feels like he wants to be a good, you know, person and that he wants to recognize me as fully human, because it all intersects. We talked about intersectionality, and we know when you layer stigmatized identities, the outcomes are even worse. So I don't know if anybody wants to share a thought on that, but the whole idea of will just makes me a little more concerned than I already am.
So Charmaine, I've got a big soapbox on that one. So I'm going to try to not pull the whole soapbox out on that, because I agree with you. You know, Ron, I think you raised a great question around will. It's interesting that you know, one of the efforts we're involved in Enterprise, the Housing Leaders Group of Greater Washington, a group of regional stakeholders, leaders in the housing industry, looking at housing affordability issues in the region, had a report commissioned years ago by the late Rick Cohen, and looking at different approaches. And at the end of the day, he ended up titling his report "Call the Question," because what he said was there are plenty of programs, initiatives, and policies, but he said it really does come down to a question of will. And it made me think about something an old high school football coach said to a guy on the team once when I was at Wilson High School in DC. He said, "Son, I can teach you technique, but I can't teach you heart." Right? At some point, you either kind of got it in you or you don't. Now, how does that apply to your question? Yes, we can make those who are interested in justice, right? We can try to make arguments and try to help bring folks to maybe a more enlightened or just point of view, transform hearts and minds and all of that, period. Next sentence. At the end of the day, we also have to recognize everybody's not going to be right on the same page when it comes to that. And we have to understand there is going to be a level of struggle, of fight, of discord, where there are going to be those who disagree. And we just got to have more numbers. And we got to be as committed as them plus one, right? And we have to be able to say that we are willing to make demands of elected officials, right? Of boardroom folks, CEOs, to say this is what is just, this is what is demanded. We hope you agree. We hope you have enlightened self-interest, et cetera, et cetera. But look also for the mechanisms where we may have to engage in ways that are a little less comfortable, and be okay with that. Because if we're not, I always say, if God's angels don't go as hard as the devil's minions, then we end up with all of the isms, schisms, and death and destruction that we continue to see now and have seen throughout history, and they won't give a damn. And while we're over here weeping about, oh, it's too bad that we all can't get along, we are continuing to see people get exploited. And so I think that for me, to Charmaine's point of your question, Ron, is that, again, the notion of where are we trying to get to if what we envision as a just society is really kind of the equity of opportunity, the repairing of gaps that have been caused intentionally, then that means we're going to have some hard conversations from the boardroom to City Hall, and to our bedrooms and church fellowship halls around the types of systems and policies and investments that we make around here.
You know, I spent some time as an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, the last several years teaching in the Africana Studies Department. And I was prompted to take my students back through a journey of looking and reading the Kerner Commission report that was done in 1967 after the Detroit uprising. And one of the things that we come to understand is that, getting around to Charmaine's statement, is there is two Americas. And how much have we closed that gap since 1967? Realistically, looking at home ownership, looking at policing, looking at economic development, I contend that in many of our communities, we have weakened ecosystems around community development. There are communities in Black and brown communities that have no organizational operations going on in their communities at all. And they're out there fending on their own. And so I think one of the strategies that we promote as an organization is strengthening the Black community development ecosystem. We need more organizations out there doing CDFI lending. We need more organizations doing financial literacy. We need more strengthened organizations that bring skills and knowledge into our communities, because right now we have deserts, just like food deserts. We have deserts where there's no organizations operating at all. So my earlier question about should organizations have a wealth building agenda, I argue yes. I tell my white colleagues who are running nonprofits that you got to use Black builders when you're working in Black communities. If you're committed to building wealth there, because you can't use extractive economies to create economies that are flourishing and growing and creating opportunities for individuals. And so again, when go back to that question of will, do you have the will to shift and really put policies in place that are moving the paradigm? Or do you again go along with the old thought of that I'll do business as usual? So so we're seeing some shifts, but what I guess to close out, and we have a few minutes to close out, in terms of your thoughts in terms of where 2 or 3, maybe 4 or 5, take a few minutes to just talk about things that you see that we need to do now going forward. We have a new administration in place. We talk sometimes about a Black agenda going forward for Black America. that's different than maybe the agendas that white America has been developing, where we can sit and identify what we see as needs going forward around home ownership, around small business development, around building our organizational capacity for our local partners and stakeholders are doing the on the ground work in our communities. So I want to just see your thoughts around that question there. Charmaine, I'll start with you.
Wow, and that's such a great question. So first, let me just couple things that we're actually doing at the MBA, which I think is part of the solution, and that is focusing on expanding opportunities for minority businesses. So homeownership is definitely one path to wealth, but there are other paths. Again, Bryan talked about multi-layered problems. Well, we need a multi-layered solution. So we'll be doing that, and we're also still focused very much on recruiting from HBCUs and making sure that students of color can see that they can be professionals in the real estate finance industry. It does go back to your point about who's serving the community. And just to put a fine point on it, if you're not pulling talent from the community and the market in which you're serving, then you might be exploiting that community. And exploitation is not a good business model and does not contribute to a healthy ecosystem. So making sure that Black businesses and businesses of color also have opportunities in the real estate finance industry is one path that we're implementing at the MBA. So I'll just stop there because there's so much more to be said on this really important conversation. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, Bryan, you're up next. What are your thoughts?
Well, certainly more representation, at the executive level of companies is going to make a huge difference. We saw that, just coming out of some of the stuff in Georgia, right? These African-American executives who, were very high profile in responding to that. Whatever you might think of it, So I think that matters. And then I want to underscore the point I made earlier about appraisals, just that we need to make sure that the wealth that we gain, we keep, and that we earn what we're entitled to. So we really do need to look at this appraisal question. As I said, it involves, the value of the homes of millions and millions of people. And we should make sure that that's right, because that is going to be the multiplier for communities of color, for people of color going forward.
Yeah, I'm going to bring David in, but I do want to make a comment about the appraisal. I was a mortgage lender for about 8 years, and I was always reminded when I talked to appraisers, particularly white appraisers, about going into Black communities, about getting knowledgeable and educated about those communities, because they put a different lens based on their experiences on the value of the property. I heard a comment by D.L. Hughley when he was trying to sell his home in LA, and he lived a few blocks from Kevin Costner, and the value that came into his property. And he was clear to say that when white folks move out of communities, they take the value with them. And so I just wanted to intersect that as an addition to Bryan's comment. And David, I wanted just to pass the mic on to you in terms of your comments.
Yeah, appreciate that, Ron. A couple of things I would say. One, just pointing to something that we're doing in Enterprise as an example, and there are many that are out here, different companies, but to a point you made about what may be needed in the ecosystem, right? And so through our Equitable Path Forward initiative, really trying to provide a range of things that would help entity level working capital, grants to build developer balance sheets, credit enhancements through a standby guarantee facility, advisory services, right, to help folks in terms of their operational side, as well as a third component of it that includes the development of new leaders in the ecosystem, kind of young leaders, because I think to Charmaine's point, we found a data point that only 16% of community development corporations are led by people of color that serve primarily, or communities that are primarily folks of color. So in some ways, you know, listen, yeah, I'm a minister. I believe we're all God's children, and anybody can serve anybody, period. Next sentence. That being said, in the context of a system that we know has the history that it does, at some level, you have to ask questions of why people who are of a certain community are not more in positions of leadership over institutions that serve that community directly. And that's a real thing. And so we have to be intentional about that. And I think we're seeing some more moves like that. So I think that making, Ron, the more and more the moves of capital from the private sector, the moves of capital on the public sector side as well, the intentionality around that, particularly as you talked about around home ownership. I'll make a quick plug that affordable rental is important because it provides a level of stability. It's part of a continuum of housing options. And so giving people stability and the ability to save some of their money. If I'm severely cost burdened and paying more than 50% of every dollar I make just to keep the lights on in my rental unit, that's going to make it harder for me to save up, right, if I want to become a homeowner. So affordable rental, even as part of the continuum. And again, I do think that looking at various approaches to ownership options is also an important thing. But last thing I'll say, Ron, and I appreciate you saying, is I also think that getting what we have seen more of, and particularly since the killing of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, it certainly didn't start there, but it has gotten heightened. The willingness of people to talk explicitly about ethnicity and goals for BIPOC communities in general and Black communities in particular, not to the exclusion of whites being involved and whites being served and all like that, but to say there are unique issues that face BIPOC communities in general, and to be comfortable saying, and there are specifically unique issues that face Black folk, right? And being comfortable then talking about policies within, I've had a number of conversations with folks in corporate America, as well as the conversations in the public sector, getting comfortable saying, yes, we have goals around Black folk, and here's why, and tying it to the history of exclusion and exploitation and dispossession that leads to the gaps in ownership and other things that we say. If we don't understand that history to a point that was made earlier by a panelist, and then get comfortable saying that we have to have approaches to address that are specifically grounded in targeting specific populations, then we aren't going to get to where we need to get to.
Well, thank all of you. We got a few minutes, and I just wanted to close out that, you know, this topic we attempted to tackle in 1 hour, but this is a ongoing conversation that needs to take place right now, 365 days a year, in every sector of our society. Because again, there is a cost, and I don't know what the true cost is, but I know there is a cost that comes with racism. And there's an economic cost, not only to those that have been impacted, but also to those that continue to practice those structural and institutional practices. We don't grow as a country. And so we have still a lot of work to do going forward. I thank all of you for sharing your time and your visions and your experiences this afternoon. I'm hoping that those who attended this workshop took something away from it that they can take back to their organizations and their communities in terms of looking at implementing change. So we have about a minute left, and I think it's time for us to sign off. But again, thank all of you, and thank the organizers of this conference for bringing this discussion forth as well. So
Thank you.
look forward to seeing you along the journey.
Take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, panelists. You did an absolute fantastic job.